This morning we're going to look at customs in the church versus our faith, and really how things come together as we meet together in the church. There are three stories that I remember, growing up in the church, working in ministry, different things about actual, not just in the church, but customs where things have become important. And sometimes when we look at the importance of these things, we start to ask the question, why is it important? And the answer sometimes doesn't, it surprises us. The first story was, it's a story about my family. When I was growing up, we always had a tradition where on Christmas Eve we would eat waffles in the early evening, so kind of a early dinner, late lunch. We would eat waffles with a strawberry compote and have ice cream with it. And this was as far back as I can remember. We still do it today. We add stuff to it. We have a bunch of sausage and eggs and all sorts of things. It's kind of like a breakfast, brunch kind of a meal, like a smorgasbord type of thing. And anyway, as far back as I can remember, we would have this meal, and I think it was just a few years ago, somebody asked my mom, why do we do this? There are 5 kids in the family. Now I think there's 17 grandkids. If we meet together on Christmas Eve, we will still do this today. And the question was asked of my mom, why do we do this? And we asked her because everybody else we had asked, we said, why do we do this? And my oldest brother, who I think just turned 50, he was asked the question, why do we do this? He didn't even know. He just remembers, and he carries on his tradition with his family, just like this one. But he didn't know. None of us knew. So we asked my mom, and my mom simply said, well, it was back in the early ministry days with your dad that we didn't have a lot of money. And the church would help compensate, but wouldn't pay an awful lot for what he was doing. And so sometimes that compensation came in like a bag of groceries or something like that. And it was Christmas Eve, and there was basically no food in the house, and there needed to be some type of meal for my family, and my mom didn't really know what to put together. Someone had come out from the church and had given a bag of groceries, and it was just enough to make waffles. They had a waffle maker. They could make waffles. They could do that. They had some eggs for like kind of a breakfast thing. They had strawberries, and that was the big thing, that someone had gotten them strawberries. And I think this was like in New Hampshire in the winter. It was kind of a hard thing to find, and they got strawberries. Well, then my parents had just enough money. They went out to the store and bought some ice cream, just something to put it all together, and to kind of make it a nice, fun meal. Well, the next year, they had enough money, they had the food, and they could make a different meal, but then my oldest brother had asked, hey, we're going to have the waffles again. And so they made the waffles again. And then the next year, they kind of started to expect it. And now we're looking at, 40 years later, we're still doing the same thing. And you ask the question, why? And it's because it's what we've always done. It was customary, it was traditional, and that's where that one kind of went. And then we have another story where I think this was my mom, my grandma. My grandma had always cut off the ends of her ham, so that right before she would cook it, she would cut off the ends, and then she would put it in the roasting pan, put it in the oven, and then bake it and roast it. And so as she did that, there was kind of this intriguing curiosity of like, why would you cut off the ends? I mean, does it make it more delicious? Is this something that would give more taste to the meal? And so finally someone had asked Grandma, why do you cut off the ends? And she actually started to think about it, and then she laughed. And because she realized what she was doing, that she'd always done, but she realized it finally, and she said, with a smile on her face, I cut off the ends because our oven, when I was growing up, was too small to fit a large ham, and so we'd have to cut off the ends so that we could fit it in to the oven. And she said, I didn't even think about the fact that my roasting pan's big enough, the oven's big enough, there's no reason for me to have to cut off the end and put it in the oven. And, it became customary, a tradition. And that's where that one went. And then there was a third one. This was when I was working in the South. I was a youth pastor at a small church in the mountains in North Carolina, and I was talking to another youth pastor. He was at a Baptist church across town, and they, for communion in the Baptist church, would only have communion once a month, and or I think as once a quarter. It wasn't very often, and so they would have the communion table, but it was a special ordeal when they did have communion. And so on those weeks when they had communion, they would come out and they would prepare the communion, the trays and everything, and then they would take a sheet and put the sheet over the communion. And it had to be done. If the sheet wasn't on the communion as the service started, then somebody in the church would be in an uproar. And this friend of mine kept telling me this story is that it just didn't make sense to him. And so he had asked somebody, why do we do this? And it was almost 90% of the church he had asked, nobody knew why they put a sheet. Someone had thought, theologically there's got to be a significance of covering up the body and the blood of Christ and then unveiling it at the right moment so that when it comes out to the people, they're ready to commune with God. And that seemed like a great answer, at least theologically, to be able to bring that together. But then my good friend Durrell found somebody who actually knew the answer to this. And it was somebody who was old enough to remember how the tradition actually started. This older lady in the church, she told Durrell that back in the days before air conditioning, in the summers it got really hot. And when it got really hot, they had to open up the doors to the church. And a lot of times when you open up the doors to the church in the summer, especially in the mountains of North Carolina, the flies start coming in. And these bugs, they get horrible. And there's some nasty insects in the south. And they would come in and they would swarm. And the problem with having a sweet drink up on the communion table with some bread to eat, those flies would just flock to that communion. And so they would take a sheet and they would cover it until they were ready, because they didn't want the flies getting to the communion. It became customary and traditional even after they got air conditioning, even after they had a way to close the door to make sure that the flies wouldn't get in. And they bought fly swatters. I don't know, whatever it is, they still use the old tradition because it was customary to them, because it made sense. It's what they saw. It's what their parents did. It's what their grandparents did. Today, we're going to deal with some of these issues of customs that become larger than the church itself at times. And I think we're in the midst right now of that happening again. I mean, if you will, the post-COVID or the COVID pandemic, the era of live streaming sermons, having people stay at home so they can watch the services in the comfort of their own homes, is starting to create some customs that might be good, might not be good for the church. But it's the response that we had to have because of what was going on, what has been going on with the pandemic. And so the church is, like any other institution, has to respond in a way that helps people. And so in that itself, we are in the midst of some of those changes. We're always creating customs for the future, but we're creating customs right now. And I think it's a good time for us to think about what those customs are so that we can be intentional about what it is we want to see the church to be. And that's why I chose these passages here today, one in Galatians 2, chapter 2, and then one in Hebrews chapter 10. I'm going to go ahead and read, and you can follow along with me in Galatians 2. It's verses 11 through 21. And so I'm just going to read the passage, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to break it down just a little bit so we can see what it is that Paul is saying in his letter to the Galatians. But he writes here, when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, "You are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? We who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified." I'm sorry, but I have to add this. Paul is using some sarcasm right here. As he is building up his logical case against, and this is Peter, Cephas, as the name as it goes through. All right, so here we have, again in verse 15, we who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no one will be justified. But if in seeking to be justified in Christ, we Jews find ourselves also among the sinners, doesn't that mean that Christ promotes sin? Absolutely not. If I rebuild what I destroyed, then I really would be a lawbreaker. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. And we see here in Paul's letter to the Galatians that he is trying to establish a logic that works for the people there in that church. They're fighting amongst each other about circumcision. They're fighting amongst each other about what it is, whether a Gentile has to become a Jew to become a follower of Christ, because Jesus himself was a Jew, and that's what's necessary according to the Jerusalem decree. You have to become a Jew. All of these things are swirling around this church in the early days as Paul is looking at this and saying, wait,